Thank you. I hate microphones. I've given many talks, but I've never given a talk after a wonderful piano piece, and it's slightly intimidating. I want to thank the Ethical Society for inviting me here today, and for all of you coming on what should be a Sunday in spring, but I'm told it will come. And I want to thank Betsy for inviting me. Betsy reached out to me in November, actually November 27th to be precise, asking me if I would give a talk on public education and what's happening and all that. And it was after the election, but it was before the current administration came in and began to dismantle every aspect of our government. Hence, my remarks will be slightly different than what she anticipated. Oh, my head?
The microphone's a little too high for you.
Oh, okay. My father always told me I was too short.
Yeah, I think we'll send you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, gotcha. So my comments are going to be a little bit different than what we both anticipated. And since I believe in truth in advertising, I want to start with 2 disclaimers. One, if you came here hoping to feel good, you should have stopped with the piano piece. Second, if you came here looking for magic solutions, there are none. But I counted it by wearing a bright color to make me cheery. But I'm hoping that if we put our heads together, maybe we can come up with something or a few somethings. All right, I just want to give a little background on me so you can understand where I'm coming from. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Brooklyn, in a working class family. We did not own a home. I grew up in a very small apartment. My dad worked nights in the post office. My mom went back to work when I was 10 to supplement his income. I went through the public school system in Brooklyn, K through 12. And then, for those of you who don't know, New York City has something called CUNY, the City University of New York, which is a wonderful system. And when I was growing up, each of the 5 boroughs had at least one 4-year college and at least one 2-year college, and it was free. Yeah, it was free. And that's how I was able to afford to go to college. And I got a wonderful education there, so wonderful that it prepared me to apply to and get accepted to graduate school with fellowships, scholarships, and research money. So my entire education was free. My husband and his 3 siblings all went through the City University system of New York. My husband is also a professor, retired, I'm about to join him. One sibling was an attorney, one a social worker in New York, and one a healthcare worker. CUNY was the engine of economic mobility for working class kids in New York. And not only did we as individuals benefit, but society benefited. There are a lot of Nobel Prize winners that came out of the CUNY system in medicine, physics, chemistry, award-winning artists, performers, musicians. And actually, in preparing for this talk, I looked up City College, because City College for a long time was the jewel of that system. So I wanted to see some of their famous alums. And it gave me 100. I'm not going to go through all 100, I promise. But just to name drop a few. Ira Gershwin, Stanley Kubrick, Colin Powell, Mario Puzo, Jonas Salk, the polio vaccine, Upton Sinclair, Zero Mostel, Felix Frankfurter, Kissinger, Kenneth Arrow, Nobel Prize winner in economics. I went to Queens College, and we had some famous dropouts. Paul Simon and Carole King went there many years before me, and they never finished. So even the dropouts of the system. What that system did was create a well-educated, burgeoning middle class in New York, and many of us filled it out. On a personal note, education radically changed my life. It took me from where I was into another world. It expanded my understanding of the world. It challenged a lot of what I thought, and some of that was painful. It taught me to think, to understand, to look beyond, to look for possibilities. There is no way that I would be standing here today having a PhD, or being a college professor, if it were not for free education, K through 16, and then my graduate work as well. I have not won a Nobel Prize, and I don't think it's in the cards, but I'd like to think that through my teaching and mentoring of students and community engagement work that I've made some contributions. The chances of working class kids today of having achieved what I achieved are very limited. And it's not because of who they are, it's because of where the system is at. The students that I teach at Temple are very similar to the kids that I went to college with. The difference is they are coming out with a lot of debt. In Pennsylvania, the average student debt is $35,000. Private companies are making a lot of money off of those debts, off of those kids, and off of their families. Many of us grew up in a time, many of us in this room, well, some of us in this room grew up in a time when government worked for us and we expected it to work. Yes, we bitched and moaned, yes, there were hiccups, et cetera, but for the most part, it worked. I worked my butt off in college, but the possibilities were there and the opportunities were there. Those opportunities have disappeared. And that disappearance is a function of political decisions, not financial ones. Okay, enough about that. Let me fast forward to my activities in terms of education activism in the larger context. This is pre-Trump. The education reform movement, which is based on the belief that the public sector can't do anything right, and the private sector is much more efficient and effective. Of course, efficiency is always defined in terms of costs. And yeah, the private sector can do some things less expensively than the public sector. But efficiency should not be the highest goal for everything. When we're talking about education, healthcare, transportation, we should not put that in the same bucket as a tennis racket. Yes, I'm a tennis player. And there's a lot of ineptitude and corruption in the private sector. If you look at the Enron scandal, the housing collapse, the banking collapse, in each case, government was the savior. And finally, there are some services that the private sector cannot and will not provide. The subway system in New York City, which is wonderful, all of those lines were private companies. They all went bankrupt and New York City took them over. Amtrak started as private rail companies. They went bankrupt, the federal government took it over. Why did they go bankrupt? Because the cost of providing those services was so high that if we, the consumers, had to pay it, we wouldn't consume it. So there are certain things that government absolutely has to do. Okay, so the education reform movement, the major components are charter schools, closing of neighborhood schools, vouchers, and high-stakes testing. What were my activities? Throughout my academic career, I've always done community engagement work, so getting involved in education activism was not something new for me. So this started with a couple of friends from the law school at Temple, faculty at Penn, Rutgers, Villanova, St. Joe's. We just started talking about education and our particular interest in it, and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, we decided we should expand the group beyond just, eggheads, and get practitioners in the room. And our question to them was, what kind of research will help you in your activism? We are trained researchers, we have the luxury of time, we get rewarded for doing research, so use us. So we started having a lot of conversations. And we worked with K through 12 teachers, with parents, with community activists, with college educators and the like. And in terms of research, we provided research, we spoke at town halls in order to raise awareness, we testified at SRC, that was the School Reform Commission, which ran the school district for too many years. We testified at SRC and city council meetings, we wrote op-eds, we wrote to and met with sympathetic elected officials, and there were quite a few in Harrisburg. The goal of the research that we did was really to distinguish between the rhetoric of education reform and the reality. So in terms of testing, No Child Left Behind, which was passed federal legislation under George W. Bush, was designed to close the achievement gap. I think it was supposed to close it by, 2010. That was 15 years ago. It's gotten worse. Anyway, why testing? The claim was that teachers are not accountable. They're lazy, they do what they want, nobody holds them accountable, they're protected by tenure and civil service and blah, 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 blah. So testing became a way to hold them accountable. The reality is testing became a tool to close neighborhood schools. And the schools that they were closing were in the poorest, least resource areas of the city. So rather than bolster those schools, they were tearing them down. High-stakes testing also resulted in the elimination of art, music, and phys ed programs because if it's not tested, you don't teach it. It also resulted in a style of teaching that was teaching to the test, which is a horrible way to teach, decreased teacher morale, it's a horrible way to learn. And interestingly, the research showed that only a tiny percentage of the variance in test scores across schools was a function of what went on in the classroom. Most of the variance was due to other factors: poverty, lack of health care, trauma, violence. In other words, teachers and principals were being held accountable for things that they had zero control over. So much for testing as accountability. Research on charter schools. The claim is that charter schools do a much better job than public schools. There are some excellent charter schools, and there are some excellent public schools. But when you look nationally, in the aggregate, there's no difference in performance between charter schools and public schools. Also, charter schools tend to cream students. Why? I'm claiming that I'm better. Well, I want the best students, so then I'm going to show that I am better. There's a lot of barriers to access. They'll require that parents come for an interview during the day. Well, low-income parents are working, they can't come. So there's just a lot of barriers that are put up. Educational vouchers, what's the claim there? You're giving parents choice, so that if your child is in a low-performing school, we're giving you a voucher that's worth X amount of money, you can put them in a private school. Nice. What's the reality? Vouchers helped kids who were already in private schools. So in other words, they were tax dollars were subsidizing kids who already could afford to do it. For poor kids, the poorest of the poor, the vouchers meant nothing because they still had to pay the balance and they couldn't afford it. So this was tax dollars subsidizing middle and upper middle class people. So those are the three areas that we did research to provide to activists. In addition to that, there were also certain political questions that we had. One was, how do individuals become aware of issues? Second, how do they interpret those issues? Third, what motivates an individual to take action? You might be aware of something, but you're still sitting on the couch. What makes you get off the couch? And finally, what are the conditions that enable us to go from individual action to collective action? So what did we learn? Excuse me. Education policy, the education reform movement drew a lot of new actors into the political fray. The testing drew a lot of parents into the political fray, suburban and urban parents. In fact, the first opt-out movement, opting out of high-stakes testing, was in an affluent community on Long Island. So these were affluent suburban parents getting pissed off. School closings caused a lot of disruption in neighborhoods, so you had community residents getting involved. And not all of them had kids in the school, but when you close a school, it has impacts on the whole community. Layoffs of nurses and guidance counselors and reassignment of teachers brought teachers and school personnel into the political fray. So you have all these new groups coming in. And the question is, how do we negotiate across these different sectors, across geography, race, class? And a lot of these groups were not exactly the best of friends. Teachers are not always appreciative of principals, and vice versa. Parents and teachers often are at loggerheads, especially when teachers go on strike. Parents get annoyed. So how do you bring these groups together? Messaging is key. How you frame an issue will influence who you can bring into the group. So what do these diverse groups that I just mentioned have in common? Well, parents, the testing, it impacts all kids. Any kid in a public school has to do these tests. And special needs doesn't distinguish across race, class, geography. You have very affluent parents with special needs kids, very poor parents with special needs kids. The testing situation for special needs students was horrific. They filmed them while they were taking the test. You're talking about a very vulnerable population, many of whom have serious anxiety issues, and now you're filming them. So this brought a lot of parents in. And also the elimination of arts and music. A lot of parents wanted their kids to have those subjects. Teachers, as I said before, the testing had a huge negative impact on teachers, so they were able to align with parents. And I remember seeing it, so our research was Philly, mainline suburbs, and Newark and Camden. So I remember seeing signs, usually in suburban areas, big signs, we love our teachers. I'd never seen that before, so that was really positive. Students, what brings students into the fray? Well, their education is being radically changed, and their life chances are being radically changed. Administrators, principals, school superintendents, their principal's job was on the line, superintendents, the districts could lose money. So they all had a common interest. All right, so you have all these people that are starting to become active. How do we go from individual to collective action? Having organizational infrastructures is really important. Philadelphia has a long and wonderful history of activism, and a lot of organizations that have ready-made constituents and that can mobilize folks. Teachers, they had the teachers union. There was, within the teachers union, within the PFT, there's something called the Caucus of Working Educators, WE, we for short. And those were like the more progressive teachers who were saying like, we need to, when we negotiate, it shouldn't be just for salary and benefits. It should be for kids, it should be for the community, and yada, yada, yada. And they were very skilled organizers, so they were doing a lot of organizing. Parent organizations, the home and school associations, again, they can organize parents. Student organizations, Philadelphia Student Union, Youth United for Change, who had been doing organizing in schools for years with students around educational issues. Community-based organizations, faith-based institutions. POWER, I forget what it stands for, POWER is an interfaith organization in Philadelphia, and they were very active in educational battles, and they expanded beyond Philadelphia to other counties. I just want to say something about faith-based organizations. So I was born and raised Jewish. I don't practice anything, except tennis. I don't practice anything, but faith-based organizations can play a critical role in this process. My understanding is that at the heart of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is social justice. It's about fairness. It's about treating your neighbor the way you want to be treated. It's about not taking more than you need if it's taking away from someone else. So you already have those issues there, and you could extend that out to other issues such as education. And actually, if you guys have not read Reverend Barber's The Third Reconstruction, I highly recommend you read the book. I've read it 3 times because I used it in my class. It's very uplifting. It's a little old by now, but Reverend Barber is a black reverend in North Carolina. He started the Moral Mondays in North Carolina, and that's how he was reaching people. And there's one story in his book where there was some white reverend in a rural part of North Carolina that wanted him to come to his church, and he was very reluctant. He said, "You sure?" So he went, and one person in the congregation said, "What took you so long? We've been waiting for you." So faith-based organizations, I think, can play a critical role. And there was also a lot of key allies in Philadelphia. The Education Law Center, which we love, Philadelphia Public Interest Law, Community Legal Services, which played key roles in fighting for better funding, protecting students, and the like. All right. So we got all this stuff, now we got all these people. How do we talk to people? I'm going to tell you another story. A good friend of mine was doing canvassing in 2016 for Bernie Sanders in rural South Carolina. And she was partnered with this guy, and they were driving. He'd pull up to the side of the road because there's no driveways. Anyway, usually she'd knock on the door, and if the door didn't slam in her face, maybe she'd get 5 minutes with the person. She knocks on the door, says who she is, what she's doing. The guy invites her in. Now this is a guy, lifelong conservative Republican. He was sheltering an undocumented woman and her child in his house. Why? Because she was his neighbor. That's what we do for our neighbors. So my friend is in there, and they're talking about healthcare, and they're talking and talking. Meanwhile, her partner was like getting nervous and texting her, but she didn't want to interrupt. She was in there for 45 minutes, and he said to her, "Okay, I will support Bernie Sanders." And he said to her, "Nobody has ever talked to me like that before." Now, I wasn't there, but what I gleaned from that comment is 2 things. One, the people he surrounds himself with don't have the knowledge that she has about healthcare. Most of us don't. And 2, people on the left dump on people like that, so you're certainly not going to listen to them. But she talked to him as another person, totally non-judgmental, and yada, yada, yada. So the bottom line is that we need to find that common humanity. And community organizing, by the way, back in the day anyway, that's how it proceeded. You'd knock on your neighbor's door, and you wouldn't go straight to education or health. Hey, how was your day? Oh my God, my son got suspended from school. He was smoking cigarettes in the bathroom. You know, my kid's 22 and he was 15, he also got suspended. So you start talking about these common issues, and now, like, we're people. We have each other's, you're not the other, we're people. Okay, so it's important to reach out, touch the humanity of all of us. We've been led to believe over way too many years that everything is a zero-sum game. It's not. We can have a lot more than we do, all of us, as opposed to a few of us, nobody in this room, having most of it and the rest of us having crumbs. Claire McGee, who's a political economist and a wonderful speaker, she wrote a book, it's called The Sum of Us, S-U-M. And in there she talks about, I think it was in St. Louis, this was during segregation. There were municipal swimming pools, but of course it was for whites only. And then the desegregation orders came down, so they had to integrate the pool. So what did the white people do? They drained the pool. So that's become a metaphor, drain the pool. St. Louis in the summer gets really hot and really humid, so that was a really stupid thing to do. But it's like, no, I don't want you to have it, so I will cut my nose to spite my face. If you look at the statistics, the most virulent anti-government folks in this country have some of the highest poverty rates, drug addiction, and suicide rates. West Virginia, which is one of the poorest states in the nation and one of the whitest states in the nation, something like 2/3 of the kids in that state get some form of public assistance. But they're totally anti-welfare because they see it as those people who look different from me and don't want to work. So again, we need to find those points of commonality, and as gloomy as things get, we need to continue to hope. I'm going to share 2 more stories. I hope I'm okay on time. Years ago, right when high-stakes testing was about to come, I was in a meeting with some nonprofits and folks from the school district. And one of the women who I'd known for years through nonprofit work, she was telling us that these tests are coming down the pike. So I raised my hand and I said, well, why don't we just refuse to give the tests? And her comment was, that's Barbara Ferman. And everybody thought it was crazy. But this huge opt-out movement, national movement, suburban, urban, they were saying no to the tests. So we need to push out the boundaries. And another story. In 2016, when Bernie Sanders was running in the Democratic primary, and he was advocating for, he's from Brooklyn, by the way, he was advocating for free college education at public institutions. And I remember, I forget his name, but the president of Susquehanna University wrote a letter to the Inquirer saying why that's not possible. And I'm reading it, and I'm no fun to be around when I'm reading the newspaper. You can ask my husband. I'm like livid. I'm like, we all went through that system. It is possible. So what we need to do is to change the narrative from austerity to possibility. So much of what is labeled socialism and communism today is what most of us grew up with. A government that cared about its people. My dad had a pension. He was a civil servant because he worked for the federal government. He had health insurance. We didn't have much money, but we were covered. It's not socialism. Finally, these are dark times. So in the work we do, we also need to do self-care. It's really, really important. You know, the deep breathing, the meditation, whatever you do for self-care, it's really, really important to do that. And I urge us to do that, but also to try and think of what's possible. And the Ethical Society is part of that organization structure in Philadelphia, so thinking, talking, etc. So I wish I played piano because then I would end with a nice piece like we started with. So I thank you again for inviting me here, and what am I supposed to do now? What do I do now?